Hi everyone, my name is Scheer from the Innovation Center Denmark, and we're here in Tel Aviv. And today we're focused on the understanding of the green tech ecosystem within Israel, and specifically impact investing and activities related to impact startups. And we're going to meet two leading stakeholders in this field, Nir Shimony, the CEO of Tech for Good, and Yoel Cheshin, who is one of the largest impact investors here in Israel and the founder of To Be Hub, the co-working space that we're going to be visiting today. Come on and let's have a look. Nir, can you say a few words about yourself and where we are today?
Sure, it's a pleasure being with you. We're at To Be Hub, which is part of the To Be group. It's kind of the physical home, I think, for the Israeli impact innovation industry. Yoel will probably talk more about this later, but it's something that evolved as part of the evolvement of our ecosystem, and I think of the role that our ecosystem plays globally. As for myself, I come from the business sector. I was working for the Antitrust Authority for a big telecom operator. I was a co-founder of a fintech startup. And 7 years ago, I kind of had this moment in life. It wasn't a moment, it was actually a process where I wanted to do something good in my life. Now, good is something very subjective. It's something that it's part of your education of who you are. But I wanted to do something I didn't know. I simply didn't know the phrase impact at the time. But I wanted to do something that is impactful without compromising on innovation, on technology, on making a lot of money by addressing social and environmental problems. And that's where I came across Omri Boal, my partner, and both of us, she came from the social sector. And I think the two mindsets that we brought to the table helped us come up and build the concept of Tech for Good.
Fantastic. And what is Tech for Good now, 7 years later?
First of all, it's totally different from what we thought 6 or 7 years ago. Today, I think in general, I can say that we're one of the leading companies, maybe even in the world, that kind of converges together innovation, business, social, and environmental impact. We think that, and the pillars behind, or the thought behind Tech for Good, that the first one is that impact, whether social or environmental, presents a huge opportunity. We need to look at impact as an opportunity and not as a problem, not at impact, but at social and environmental issues as opportunities and not as problems. This is a small change in mindsets that enable, a whole new perspective on those issues. Second is that technology can definitely help you scale the levels on impact. And the third thing is that no single entity can address a social or environmental issue. And this is why we try to, and I'll explain deeper in a minute, this is why we try to foster and create those cross-sector and cross-geography collaborations, because these are too big of issues that can be addressed by one entity. In practice, we do three things. The first thing that we do is open impact innovation. That's a very well-known practice among, I think, every major corporate worldwide today. There is a certain degree of innovation that happens in-house and certain degree of innovation that is outsourced or is done through external innovation. Impact innovation is becoming, in the past 7 years, it's becoming more and more mainstream. It's converging with the business. If a few years ago, large-scale corporates were looking at impact as part of their CSR activity, and business, that's their core thing that they do. The two are now converging, and they start looking at impact as opportunity and something that is part of their value proposition to their customers, something that they differentiate themselves according to, and they outsource some of the innovation. And this part of the business, of the Tech for Good business, is providing large-scale organizations with open innovation services of impact innovation technologies and strategies that will help them increase their revenues, their profits, but also increase their impact, their positive impact on the world, by the way, and we were talking about carbon emissions, or reduce the negative impact that they do. So that's what we do, and within this line of business, we help corporates from all over the world, by the way, structure the strategy and then execute it using technologies from all over the world. This is one line of business. The second line of business is what we call Tech for Good International. Throughout the years, we've developed, I think it's very important to emphasize that impact is not just about, it's not a story that you tell. It's not a YouTube video that you upload to YouTube that is very emotional. It's something that is very structured and methodological. The typical methodologies for impact were created for corporates, B Corp, for example. I think that Tech for Good has developed a methodology, a bottom-up methodology based on the experience that we have working with hundreds of startups that enables structuring and impact and embedding it into the DNA and the matrices of any startup, and seeing to it that it has a fit to the market needs. Mm-hmm. Now, we've built this into a very clear and structured methodology. And our second line of business is providing international entrepreneurs with our know-how and with access to the Israeli market. Not just these are programs, it's usually done as some sort of a joint venture with governments that want to see to it that their impact innovation sector develops. They send entrepreneurs here, or we go to other countries and we train the entrepreneurs with our methodology. The third thing that we do is it's about showcasing. So we do an annual, the Israel Impact Summit. I think it's one of the biggest impact innovation events worldwide every year. We take part in international forums that talk about measurement and the future of the impact innovation industry.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's super relevant also from a Danish and a Nordic context, that we sort of, I think in the Nordics we have this idea that we want to do good, and we also need to, in order to maintain the welfare states, we need to actually sort of create profits, create taxes that then can finance schools, hospitals, public servants, and so forth. You talked a lot about sort of the impact methodologies. You talked about sort of the evolving scene. Could you say a little bit about sort of in your time over the last decade or so, how that's changed and how sort of the common misconceptions that people have about this field?
Sure. First, again, it's a slow evolution, but it's not linear, meaning what happened, and you can attribute some of it to COVID and the way that people's perspective on life and business changed in the past 2 years. But the ecosystem has evolved dramatically. If 7 years ago in Israel, there was an absolute separation between the social and environmental worlds, which were either dealt with by the government, or by the very relatively developed NGO world in Israel. Mm-hmm. And then there was the business sector. Now, I was mentioning before the fact that once you do this small shift in your mindset and start looking on social and environmental issues on opportunities, all of a sudden you find those incredibly huge blue oceans that you can play in. And I think once you dive into some very major environmental or social issues, you find out that these present some of the biggest opportunities, financial opportunities in history. We were discussing the aging population, food security, food loss, and sustainable agriculture, and many other areas. So I think what has changed is the perspectives and the mindsets, and people started looking, people, I mean, I'm talking about corporates, investors, and definitely entrepreneurs started looking at those things as opportunities. Now, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Now, when you look at where the financial opportunity, it goes without saying that it's in the business sector. That's where the big money is, mainly with corporate money.
Mm-hmm.
At least when you try to shift an industry and draw attention to the impact world. Now, corporates started looking at impact. Some of them did this because of the changing demand by their customers. The millennials and the Z generation are embedding impactful thinking into their lifestyle and to their actions. Some of them were looking at the opportunity because of their shareholders, who are also, they're no longer baby boomers, they are millennials who have this. Some of them look at this because of their kind of risk mitigating the risk of future regulations, CO2 emissions, for example. So there are huge powers that were shifting the market, and all of a sudden, the demand side for solutions that is mainly driven by corporates and investors started focusing on social issues. This really met the supply side of very passionate entrepreneurs who had and still have huge passion to address those issues, but without compromising on making lots of money.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I really believe, is the most important role of Tech for Good, is seeing to it that global demand for innovative impact solutions meets the DNA of entrepreneurs,
mm-hmm.
and we create an environment that enables a dialogue between the two, and the rest will.
Yes.
Okay.
And tell me, I think one of the things that we see a lot in the impact space, there's lots of players. Sometimes there's government, there's NGOs, there's startups, there's Tech for Good and other organizations. I wonder sometimes in terms of sort of the startups activity and others, there's often, immature markets, or they're within, the balance of an Israeli local market and a global market. But they may be very different. And sort of how do you work with pilots? How do you work with sort of startups that want to have impact, and at the same time, the impact may look very different according to the geography and country that you're in?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that I know the answer, but we are taking some actions to kind of to close the gap between the demand. We call this the gap. We do a gap analysis in certain areas between the demand, which can really differ by geography or whatever, and what usually early stage startups think are the problems. We need to kind of mitigate this. And there are a bunch of things that we do. First, it's awareness. We really believe in the power of the corporate world specifically to kind of address the entrepreneurship world, the entrepreneurs, and to talk about their needs and their opportunities. It's not about, secretly finding the one startup that will kind of solve your problems. It's about joining forces and seeing to it that the more they introduce their needs and their opportunities and their focus areas and go deep into those issues, the more startups will be able to come up with better solutions that better fit their needs. And this is something that we invest a lot in through public events, through the fact that we really present when we're working with corporates, and when we are looking for startups for a corporate.
Mm-hmm.
We don't just scout for them, but we do a lot of work. It sometimes takes months to showcase their needs, to talk about their problems. And then we collect a database of startups and solutions that might fit this need. Then starts the slow process of reducing the gap.
Yeah.
And this is something that changed dramatically. By the way, today, when you look at Israeli startups, I don't think, I know for a fact that because we kind of constantly monitor this, around 1,000 Israeli startups are addressing different issues, directly addressing the Sustainable Development Goals, which is amazing. It's almost, I don't know, 20% of all startups address social and environmental issues.
And I think for us, from the Nordic perspective, one of the things that we've realized is that sort of, as you already mentioned, the world is changing, and it's changing in steps and not linearly. Where do you see this going sort of 5 to 10 years from now? When you think of, you know, the what we call the gray, silver gray, or gray gold, as we call it in the Nordics, I think you called it silver money. And where do you see sort of different those spaces going? And also, where do you see the startups and the corporates moving in that area?
I think that the market, I'll start with the startups. The market is evolving dramatically in terms of the number of startups, the quality of the startups, the amount of money invested in those startups is growing dramatically. What we're currently missing is those huge success stories. Israel as the startup nation's legacy was built on, at the end of the day, on major exits. Okay, on billions of dollars that were invested and exited in those companies. What we're now looking, I think that 10 years from today, we will see major success stories, and these will give a dramatic boost to the startup industries and also draw a lot of capital, more capital into the market.
Into those 20% that you mentioned earlier, into those impact-oriented startups.
Definitely. Now, I think that the process of impact and sustainability converging with core business of governments and investors, institutional investors, for example, will continue. And it's not just a hype. It's not a hype when you invest in real estate or in, I don't know, blue chip stocks. Okay, it's something that is here to stay. And I will have to quote, I wish it was my saying, but I will quote Sir Ronald Cohen, who's the father of impact investing, the godfather of impact investing globally, when he was saying that previously, after the early 20s of the past century, the financial crisis, people before that people were looking at returns. After the 1920s, people started looking at risk versus return, and this was the investment mindset. And in the future, within 10 years, people will look at risk, return, and impact as the three parameters that they look at when they invest money. It's already happening. There are problems, issues related to measurement and to reporting. There is no kind of acceptable way to report this. I think once this goes mainstream, and it will, the impact will not be kind of a separate market. You will not be distinct between impact investment and non-impact investment. It will all be part of any investment transaction.
And given that the role sort of, I think one of the sort of assumptions that is embodied in that statement is basically looking at saying the private market will take over more of that role. The investment will take over more. The startups will be more active. Corporates will be more active. Where do you see sort of the role of ecosystem players? Because I think that's some of the ones that we worked a lot with, whether it's clusters, science parks, university accelerators. Where do you see sort of, and in a way also tech for good, how do you see the role of those sort of, let's say, innovation supporters evolving?
That's another great question. I think that most of those innovation parks and government incentives, and there are numerous tools that in the organizations like Tech for Good, there are numerous actions and tools that you can take to see to it that the market evolves. Israel has a long history. It's a different discussion about focusing on industries and seeing to it that this specific vertical within the high-tech industry is becoming an industry. Okay? So, and most of the measures that are now being taken, their goal is to see to it that the market is evolving and that it's becoming part of the mainstream, and there is no longer need for those incentives. And this will definitely happen. I think once we're now in a phase in history, if you may, that impact is going mainstream. it's not a niche, it's not something that tree huggers do, it's not something about European or Nordic environmentalists do. It's becoming mainstream because of, I think, the business sector. Okay, it's not something that you leave out for NGOs, the UN, or governments. Once it goes mainstream, that's an amazing, that's the most important trigger for it to be very much sustainable and growing. So that's a big issue. And I think that the next phase, once it's becoming mainstream for investors, governments, entrepreneurs, the next phase, and this is how I see the role of Tech for Good in the future, is impact is a huge thing. Okay, it covers so many topics. Even the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals cover, I think, every aspect of humanity. You cannot look at this as one agenda. Okay, I think the next step for the coming years would be first to prioritize, and then to see to it where are the areas of impact that are already taken care of by market power, and where are the areas, and the world will always have areas where we need governments, welfare policy, NGOs and other organizations, and start kind of balancing between what the market can take off and where are the areas that we as humanity need to, where do we want to be and when we need to be.
And you mentioned COVID earlier, and we're now almost 2 years in, 1 year and 8 months or so. And I think one of the big topics in the Nordics is currently sort of this idea of building back better. And I think actually it originated in the Nordics, and now President Biden and others have taken up on that. Where do you see within the impact space that sort of things can be built upon in the near future, or already things that happened over the last 18, 24 months that have fundamentally shifted both how you operate, but also what you see in terms of innovation?
That's it's almost a philosophical question. But I think historically speaking, different types of crises, like the financial crisis in the 20s or in 28, or totally different thing, big war, the world wars, and the COVID as a global crisis really changed minds, caused a change in mindsets that is relatively, in historical perspective, are really fast. Okay, like the idea of working from home or reducing your traveling, international traveling, and using, I think the whole concept of labor and work has changed. What people were discussing for a couple of decades happened within 18 months, started happening and triggered this. So definitely the world is changing. The second thing that I saw is that and it's a psychological thing, I think, that when there is a crisis, then people all of a sudden go back to the basics. We were talking about the aging population. We have been working in this area for over 4 years now. Now, before COVID, I will make a general statement, not many people or organizations really cared or really saw the opportunity. Once COVID kind of changed everything and it became a real crisis, people kind of start looking at basic things, like what will happen in the future, what will my old aging look like, what about food security, what about the environment, because we have time and we have the kind of, it brings out philosophical questions to mind. And what I saw, and I consider a positive thing, if I may, about the COVID, is that it really started drawing not just mindsets, but also actions. We see more and more organizations, like you mentioned, looking at environmental issues and going back to the basics. We see people looking at the food industry differently, the food supply and supply chains. We see people looking differently at old age. And these are things that I think are blessed, and I really can hope that what COVID triggered will become part of the new norm if there will be something like this in the future.
Amazing. And maybe you talked about a little bit the Innovation Summit, you talked about some of the other things. What are ways that Nordic and Danish stakeholders, and you can say about different ways, maybe there's ways for startups to get engaged, maybe there's ways for corporates, or maybe even for NGOs or government actors. What are some of the ways that they can engage with tech for good and with the Israeli ecosystem from your point of view?
I think that there is kind of this misconception in Israel. I think it's also, it's a misconception in other places. Israelis look at the world as their target market and a source of capital, okay? Which I basically think is a mistake. It's not the right way to look at this. Other countries look at Israel as the startup nation and source for ideas, and why don't we take those ideas and bring them to our countries or countries? I think that the best way to look at this, and this is something that we would love to do with the Nordics, is really to create a bridge. It's all about dialogue. It's not just about attracting startups into the Nordics. It's not just about bringing Nordic capital into Israeli startups. It's about a dialogue and a conversation about what we can do together. Now, I really don't believe that Israeli startups will start focusing on the Nordics, but I think in terms of DNA, there is a lot that we can share, and there are a lot of areas where we're complementary. Speaking about specifically about impact, your welfare policy as something that not the state of Israel should do, but rather entrepreneurs, Israeli impact entrepreneurs, find a way to make it more efficient and more scalable in an innovative way. That's an amazing thing that we can do, but we're not aware. Our ecosystem is not really aware of the Danish or Nordic welfare ecosystem in such a way that we can come up with great ideas. So this is why we need to create this dialogue. There is a lot that we can learn from the Nordics on how to build sustainable companies. The Israeli tech ecosystem is venture capital and is a lot about risk, high rewards and high risk and quick wins. I think that this is something that is not good. And I think that when we're talking about the impact industry, there is a lot of patience in terms of when do you expect to see success and what is defined as success. Is it making a huge exit or making an impact on billions of lives around the world? And this is another area where we can collaborate. I also think that part of this dialogue should be helping entrepreneurs from the Nordics learn a little bit from our methodologies and the DNA that makes us the startup nation, but not in a way of educating you, but adding a layer. And I think there is a lot of place where entrepreneurs from both areas can collaborate and really scale the impact using both the advantages of each area. I think there is a lot. There is simply lack of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And that's a shame, and that's something that we should address and build long-term sustainable collaborations between the countries.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Nir.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
That was super.